Сега е ред да представя професор Клеминсън с няколко думи. Той е стар познайник на нашето медиевистично малко общество. В продължение на много години, вече станаха от 1994 година насам, той присъства на наши форуми и ръководи наши докторанти и е съветник на всички нас до много голяма степен в няколко области. Аз само тук ще спомена 3 от тях. Едната е, че той се занимава като изследовател с превода на Апостола, откривателя на няколко ръкописа, които са фрагменти, но са много важни за историята на тази библейска книга. Освен това, той се занимава с описанието на славянски ръкописи в различни страни, публикува няколко описа. Това, което отличава неговата работа, е, че той се опитва да направи една актуализация на традиционните параметри на описите на славянски ръкописи, която ние всички преживяхме тук през последните десетилетия. Съобразяването с компютърните технологии и последната област, за да не продължава много дълго, е именно приложението на компютрите в хуманитаристиката, в която той е водещ специалист. Приемането на глаголицата в Unicode е негово дело и негова инициатива. До голяма степен приемането на старата кирилица също. Това са без всяко преувеличение революционни крачки в нашата област, за да може всичко да се вижда както трябва в интернет. Освен това, той е председател на нашата комисия за компютърна обработка и анализ на славянски ръкописи към Международния комитет на славистите. И какво да кажа друго, освен професор в няколко университета и наш любим колега. Така че му давам думата.
Благодаря.
Here be dragons. In 1988, when I published the Union Catalogue of Cyrillic manuscripts in the British Isles, I was somewhat bemused to find that all the excitement that was generated here was not around one of the great Cyrillic Tetraevangelia, of which we have a few, but around a manuscript which, from the point of view of the catalogue, was entirely marginal. I mean, of course, row 27 in the Bodleian, which is an 11th century Greek manuscript containing some of the homilies of St. John Chrysostom. And the reason that this provoked such interest around here was that in the 12th century some Bulgarians had been scribbling in the margins and had left some both written and drawn material, including a sort of dragon, a kind of two-headed serpent, which my friend and colleague Dilyana Radoslavova has identified as a malevolent spirit known in Balkan folklore as the Budorica. And indeed, the interest continues. If you come to the Byzantine conference in August, you will be able to hear Nadezhda Dragova talking on the same subject, where she has discovered Bogumilska Risovana Bogoslovia. I suppose that was bound to happen eventually. Although the sermons were intended to be preached in the first week of Lent, which is apparently the season when Tudorice are active, there is a somewhat tenuous connection between the original manuscripts and the material in the margins, which at the most is placed there apropos of the text rather than having any integral relation to it. And in fact, what we have here is essentially a usurpation of the marginal area. And if you think of a small child faced with a field of fresh snow, he will either tiptoe around the edges so as not to spoil it, or he will rush straight across it to leave his mark. And there are certain readers of manuscripts who seem to belong to the latter category and cannot face a margin without putting something in it, even if it's only as shtoch. And so you get inscriptions relating to the weather, to politics, to all kinds of events, or indeed you get completely different texts. So I think of, for example, the manuscript Quarto Ecclesiasticus Slavonicus 14 in the Orsa Kosečiny Köftar in Budapest, which is a psalter, but written out in entirety. In the margins of the pages are two texts. One is the Epistola a Cielo Missa de Servanda Dia Dominica, and the other is the 12 Dreams of King Shahaisha, which has already been mentioned this week. Moreover, the psalter is in Slavonic, and the additional texts are in Romanian, so there's really no relation at all. In fact, the margin is no longer functioning as a margin, it is simply functioning as the field for a separate text. So what we have here are essentially marginal graffiti. But one also has marginal commentary, which is much more interesting. And this can be scribal or non-scribal, that's to say it can be provided by the person who writes the original text, or it can be added by someone else later. Very rarely is it authorial. In other words, very rarely is it provided by the person who actually composed the original text rather than writing it out. And this use of the margin has a very, very long history. It goes right back to Alexandria, when critical texts of Homer were produced with marginal signs to indicate the status of various passages of text. And these signs can then develop into glosses, explications of particular words, or whole commentaries. Here you are. This is manuscript in what I still think of as the Publiczka in St. Petersburg, Греческая 64, folio 130. The manuscript is a psalter written in the year 944, and what you have here is the end of Psalm 97. I shall use Septuagint numeration throughout, and the beginning of Psalm 98, and commentary on these particular passages written all round about them in the margin. And you get similar things. This is Rila, manuscript 414, which the text is from the book of Job. What we have on this page is chapter 10 verse 16 to chapter 11 verse 10, with rather less extensive commentaries, in fact more in the forms of glosses to individual passages. But the Slavs can be extensive as well. This is unfortunately not a very good reproduction, but you can see the layout, which is what matters here. This is the Apostolos Christiopolitanus, folio 49 verso, which has the text of the Epistle of St. James, chapter 4, verses 4 to 9. And not only does it have commentary round about it, but it also has marginal numerals and titles which relate to the Euthalian apparatus, which very often accompanies the text of the Acts and Epistles in the manuscript tradition, both Greek and Slavonic, and relates to the organization and contents of the text. So what effectively you have in all these instances is a central panel of text, and round about it you have information about the text. So you have text and paratext, or data and metadata, with the one in the middle, and in the margin you have the text about the text, which is itself a text. And the more the commentary is seen as a text, the more it tends to be brought in from the margins. Given, if not equal status, but nevertheless textual status, you will immediately, of course, be thinking of the Bologna Psalter, which again we've seen already this week, where the commentary is no longer in the margin, but is in a parallel column. So you have two columns. In larger text you have the text of the Psalms, and in smaller text, but nevertheless beside it, in the same field, no longer in the margin, you have the commentary. And this can be taken to extremes, I suppose. One looks at MS Bodley 725, and here you can see which is the commentary on Romans, where the text is still in larger letters, but it has become literally marginalized. And what you have in the central panel is the commentary, which has in fact acquired margins of its own, indicating authorship and sources. So here, what was originally the accompanying text, the paratext, has become the text. You would read this manuscript for the sake of the theological speculations which have arisen from study of the epistle, and not for the epistle itself, unlike, for example, Christina Napolitanus, where you could simply read the epistle in the central panel and ignore the commentary. You couldn't do that here. So here the margin has become the text, but more generally, in all traditions, but I think perhaps especially with the Slavonic, you have the tendency to integrate the commentary into the text, bring it in from the margin. And here you have Hilandar, manuscript 406, value 152b, which is, yes, part of the first epistle of St. Peter, chapter 3, verses 10 to 12, which are the top few lines there. And you might be able to see just at the end of the first line, Sushte, in other words, the actual text, and then a little further down, Tulkovanie. But although the commentary has been brought in from the margin is still in use. You notice along the side you have all these marginal signs, this little row of comma sort of things, which indicate that the text alongside them is commentary. So the margin again provides the indication that distinguishes it. In other manuscripts you may have similar things, where you may have even one of my favourites, QP15 in the Publiczka, nie czti tolku. Don't read the commentary. In other words, if you're using this manuscript to read in church, then of course you're only supposed to be reading the epistle, you're not supposed to be reading out the commentary as well. And so the margin here is still used to preserve the distinction between metadata and data, or between paratext and text. And of course, any confusion of the two can be catastrophic. You may be aware that in the Preslav redaction of the Apostolos, in the reading for the 31st Sunday after Pentecost, this distinction has been lost in half the manuscripts. Literally half the manuscripts. The unwitting reader would end up reading commentary because there's nothing to tell him that it's commentary, poor fellow. So, margins therefore are always informative. They are what surrounds the text, they are the context, and they tell us something about it. Even if there's nothing there, even if there's nothing in the margin, that still says something about the status of the text. If you think of all your great manuscripts, the Codex Alexandrinus, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Ostromir Codex, they all have big, wide margins, which have both an aesthetic function and also draw attention to the importance of this text and of the text in this manuscript. Even today, for example, if you are writing to some important personage, to royalty or to the President of France or somebody like that, etiquette dictates that you use large format paper and leave wide margins, as I'm sure you always do. And of course the presence of space around the text also allows for visual commentary, and I should stress that this is not the same thing as illustration, although of course the distinction between them does tend to get blurred, because illustration occupies the same field as text. If you have an illustrated manuscript, you will have either illustrations which are instead of the text or combined with the text, but in the same space, whereas visual marginalia are essentially commentary, and this goes especially true of the Psalter, a tradition that goes back a long way. Conrad Borch has traced it as far back as Assyria, and of course the Psalter is a prophetic book, so within the text you have the Old Testament type, and within the commentary you can find the Old Testament antitype, and we have a good example of this if you take, for example, what is explicitly a messianic psalm, so Psalm 21. Here we are. This is the Theodore Psalter, which is a manuscript written in 1066 in Studion in Constantinople, now in the British Library. And here we have Psalm 21 verse 12. Many bulls have compassed me. And what we find here, unfortunately the preservation is not great, but you have the Lord Jesus surrounded by this man-headed bull and the bull-headed man and all kinds of monstrous things, and of course the not only the visual commentary but the little written explanation of this commentary, Tabri I Evrei. On the next page of this same manuscript, you have verse 16 of the psalm. Dogs have compassed me. And again you have cynocephaly. Yeah. And again, oops, I didn't intend to do that. Still, you might be able to see it. Yes, cynocephaly, slightly out of control. And again, kines Evrei. The same page has, in fact, 2 verses later, they parted their garments amongst me. Again, this is shown. I'm getting slightly out of control, but there you are. And later on, another psalm, Psalm 57, verses 4 to 5. Their poison is like the poison of a serpent, which will not hearken to the voice of the charmer, charming never so wisely. Now this, of course, is something that you can't resist if you're going to be illustrating a serpent. There you are, a serpent being illustrated, and then a serpent being charmed, but not taking any notice. And finally, my absolute favourite, the triumph of literalism, Psalm 72, verse 9. They set their mouth against their heavens, and their tongue walketh through the earth. And so it does. In fact, this iconographic scheme appears also, I will show you again, in a Russian manuscript, in the Kiev Psalter, where you have the same illustrations. Here the tabri are reduced to men with horns, but note the little red line that connects the illustration with the specific verse that it comments on. And there's no written reference to who they are there, or indeed here, but you have some rather nice cynocephaly. Yes, the Russians don't seem to be really familiar with the concept of snake charming, and the Zmi. The Zmi has become assimilated to rather more northern European folklore, and I just can't resist that. Anyway. So much for explicit commentary. There is also implicit commentary, where the text invades the margin, or rather the scribe makes use of the spatial layout to provide information or metadata about the text that he's producing. We've already seen some marginalizations, initials this week in the paper of Regina Koicheva. Here are some more. This is the Grimbold, no it isn't, this is the Ramsey Psalter, Harleian manuscript 2904, written in Winchester, where I come from, despite what it says on the programme. in the late 10th century, and where you can see obviously that each verse begins with a large initial and the new psalm begins with an even larger initial. Or again here, this is the Grimble Gospels, yes, additional manuscript 38490 in the British Library, slightly later written in Canterbury. What you can see on this page is the passage from Luke chapter 21 verse 26 to chapter 22 verse 4, and again you can see the large initials serving to introduce sections of text. The more important the textual division, the larger the initial, and also quite interesting, you see a later marginalium here, caput 20 secundum. Of course, this manuscript was written in around 1020, which is before the Latin Bible was divided into chapters. The chapters come later, and a later hand has added this. But note that it comes already at a major textual division, so this shows how the Latin chapters are in fact in many cases a formalization of an existing tradition of division. And also down the left hand margin here you can see the Eusebian sections, which are of course the reference system. Now, of course many of you will be familiar with the work of Elisabetta Musakova, who has written extensively on the use of decoration, chiefly in Cyrillic and Glagolitic manuscripts, to point the structure and hierarchy of the text and the relative importance of various passages according to the elaboration of their decoration. And of course the two tendencies can be combined in historiated initials. The letter Zimyar is just asking to be turned into a dragon after all, isn't it? And there you are. Now, illuminators of secular manuscripts have greater freedom because you are providing in your secular manuscript simply pleasure. You're giving visual as well as literary enjoyment. This is part of the Lancelot cycle with all kinds of rabbits. There you go. Where the object of pleasure, there is really no particular need for coordination between the visual and the textual. And there's a long tradition of it. If you think of the Bayard Tapestry, you have a visual narrative in the broad central panels taking place between two narrow panels of total irrelevance. And in the but in the West, this may rather get out of hand. This is Royal Manuscript 1D1 in the British Library, which is manuscript of the Gospels, written in Oxford around the middle of the 13th century. And here we have the prologue, beginning of the prologue to St. Matthew. Well, as you'll recall, the Gospel of St. Matthew begins the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so it's entirely appropriate to have the tree of Jesse in the historiated initial. But what are these things in the margins with horses' legs and swans' necks and human faces? They shouldn't really be there. And of course it's the Psalter, which already has the tradition of marginal illustration, that has the wildest excesses. If we look at, this is the Nottingham Psalter, wonderful manuscript now in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and these are undoubted masterpieces of manuscript illumination, where from an artistic point of view they are wonderful things, even if from the point of view of the text of the Psalter they may be irrelevant, or indeed bizarre, if not downright indecent. And an even perhaps more extreme example of this is of course the famous Luttrell Psalter, example, here, where you have all kinds of grotesques and so on into the margin. What is that thing? And one really sympathises with the former curator of manuscripts at what was then the British Museum, who says, "The mind of a man who could deliberately set himself to ornament a book with such subjects and hideous creatures can hardly have been normal." And other people have tried to rationalise this in a present commentary from the British Library notes. "These 2 pages display a variety of religious figures, scenes from everyday life, and grotesques, perhaps symbolising the outlying realms of chaos against which faith is the defence." And much has been written about the way the medieval mind accommodated the 2 extremes seen in the world in terms of dualities, requiring the monstrous as a counterpart to the sacred. And the problem with this sort of theory is that in reality the medieval mind experienced exactly the same difficulties with this sort of thing as the modern mind does. We have, for example, Saint Antoninus of Florence, who comments, "In historias etiam sanctorum sui ecclesiis pingeri curiosa, quae non valant ad devotionem excitandum, sed risum et vanitatem, ut simias et canes insequentes lepores, et huius modi vel vanos honoratus vestimentorum, et superfluum videtur et vacuum." He is, in fact, in a tradition which goes back to St. Bernard. But you will note that he's not anti-aesthetic. He's not opposed to decoration itself, so long as it serves ad devotionem excitandum, so long as it brings your mind to the religious subject instead of distracting from it. He's quite, and one has to admit that the Luttrell Psalter is not a functional book of devotion. And let's face it, you couldn't keep your mind on your prayers with that thing looking at you. And however beautifully written the text is, when we look at it, what we're looking at is the decoration. We're only secondarily aware, if we're aware at all, that the book contains the Psalms. And I've no doubt that Sir Geoffrey Luttrell looked at it in the same way. So, in this manuscript, to try and maintain the text-marginal relation is, in fact, to misread it. It stands outside that system, or, if you insist on maintaining the system, the manuscript itself is illegitimate. The proper relation between text and margin is, of course, something like this, which is, again, a manuscript in Sofia in the Церковный исторический архивный институт, number 213. As you can see, is the text of the Gospel, where you have the number in black of the Kephalion, the Greek chapter division, the number of the pericope, and the proem to the pericope, together with an indication of the date for which it is intended. So you have nice text, paratext, or data, metadata, and this is continuing from the earliest times into the modern age. Here we have an early 20th century printed book, where again the margin is used to indicate the organisation of the text, the subjects which are treated. Or here we have a slightly more sophisticated one, where you have the running titles which don't actually correspond to the chapters. You have the one on the left-hand side, on the verso, which indicates a larger section of the book, and the one on the right-hand side which indicates the immediate subject matter of this opening. Then you have the marginal indications in the left and right-hand margins indicating references to the scriptures, to the Talmud. And in the bottom you have the footnotes, as we're used to. Or again, another even more recent and even more complex example. This is a modern edition of the Greek New Testament, where you have your running title at the top telling you not only which gospel you're in, but which chapter and verse you're in. You have the chapter and verse numbers in down the sides in the outer margins, and then Further out from them, you have again parallel passages. In the inner margins, which unfortunately I haven't managed to scan very neatly, but you'll have to believe me that these smudges are in fact the Eusebian canons. And down in the lower margin, you have the textual apparatus. And this sort of layout is maintained, of course, amongst the traditionally minded, although in recent years it's become very much under attack, partly I think due to cheap typesetting. I won't go into that. And here we have a very recent book where you will notice we still have running titles and page numbers, but we have hardly any margin. And the margins are extraordinarily narrow in this, in comparison with perhaps more traditional print layouts. But still, this is still a printed book. At some stage, ink has been applied to paper. But what we then ask about electronic text. Electronic text doesn't allow margins. Those of you who are familiar with CSS will know that, of course, every text block, that's to say visual unit of text, actually must have in fact 4 margins, but margins must not, by definition, contain anything. They can have width, but they can't have content. And in fact, we tend not to notice any problem because electronic text typically is either a reproduction of print media. So, for example, if that were to be digitized, you'd still have the same layout. This would still be page 611, and its relationship to page 612 will more or less reflect the fact that in the original they were printed on opposite sides of a piece of paper of a particular size. But here you have native electronic text, which doesn't deal in paratext, it deals in hypertext. Its organization is in fact to be seen in terms of links between different files, different electronic files with no visual status of their own, sitting in various parts of the server, or indeed on different servers. So the question then arises, well, what happens if you're trying to produce something in the traditional form, the sort of thing that you would normally have published as a book or an article, but not publishing it in print, publishing it in electronic form straight away, which people do nowadays. Here is an example. And, well, it still has endnotes with hyperlinks to them, but otherwise you just have this continuous stream of text. And how do you refer to this? How do you cite it? There are no page numbers, for example, and there's nothing here except text, footnotes, and there is very little in the way of visual structure here. And are we going to? If this becomes the norm for publishing, is the cry going to go up? Give us back our margins. It's difficult. It's difficult to produce HTML that looks like this. It can be done, just. It shouldn't be done, really, because, and the reason it shouldn't be done is that the relationship between, in print media, the relationship between text and page is fixed by physical characteristics. In electronic media, the relationship between text and screen is entirely contingent. But there are ways of linking text in electronic media. Here's an example. Where you have 3 parallel texts and commentary, all nicely linked together on one screen. This may be the future. Who knows? Point here.
Благодаря на професор Клемисън. Ви давам думата за въпроси към него, коментари. Малко сме напреднали на времето, така че ви моля за бърза реакция. Може на български, на руски, на английски, както искате. Професор Клемисън владее няколко славянски език. И не славянски доста. Така че заповядайте. I have one question. Why in Orthodox tradition we haven't katenas and commentaries of, for example, prophet books older than 15th century? Maybe I'm wrong.
You are.
Yes, I am wrong. Margaret is a specialist in this area.
Yes, and there are perhaps...
I mean katanas in the margins.
Well, you have Christian Boletonius, for example, which is a 13th century manuscript, early 13th century manuscript, which contains a katena, which I showed you admittedly in a rather poor reproduction a few minutes ago. Of course, the katena is itself, from the Slavonic point of view, a translation. So the notion of compiling a katena, I think, is one which does not exist in the Slavonic tradition. It does in the Greek tradition, of course, but not in the Slavonic tradition at an early period. But that's simply because the Greeks had already done it, and all the Slavs needed to do was translate it.
Thank you.
Well, this is a very marginal question, I'm afraid, and due to my ignorance of your beautiful subject. Well, from your comments about the margins and so on, well, I thought my question is, might there be a connection between the margins and so on, and could they be considered a sort of antecedent of our modern literary criticism?
Yes, yes, I think that is precisely the case. I mean, obviously, I've been more or less restricting myself to biblical manuscripts in what I've shown you, but in fact, of course, you do get commentary in secular manuscripts as well. Particularly, of course, in subjects such as law or medicine, where you have layouts very, very similar to some things I've been showing. But also literary texts, you may find little comments in the margins, particularly where somebody has, for example, seen or regarded this passage as containing particularly striking moral instruction or something of that nature. Yes, obviously literary criticism as such, as indeed literature as such, is a comparatively modern phenomenon, and the literary critic tends to think of himself in the modern world as producing a text rather than as producing a commentary, although still, nevertheless, you have the textual critic, you have your editions of your classical authors going, well, as I said, we start off with Homer already in classical times, and this tradition continues through editions of everyone who acquires classical status in any vernacular literature, where, of course, you do precisely get your variants in the margin. Yes?
Yes, because in a way what literary criticism does now is really take, in many cases, take the place of the author, as in some of your manuscripts where the margins are bigger than the text itself, which yes, it's a sign of the overwhelming power maybe of the commentator with respect to the original text, which in my opinion that's what literary criticism does in many cases, shadowing the presence and the protagonism of the author, herself or himself, and just the literary critic becomes the author.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. Puis ça change.
Thank you. Another questions? Margaret Dimitrov.
You show very interesting examples for differentiation between the text and commentary, and what is really beautiful, how the paratext becomes text and vice versa. But what surprises me is this example of the Kilmer manuscript, I think, on the margins with apostrophe,
Yes.
the commentaries
Yes.
are marked.
Yes.
So,
This surprises you.
yes.
Oh.
Because usually, in this case, the biblical quotations are not indicated in, because usually this is used for indication of biblical quotations.
Yes, but it's used for biblical quotations in, whoops, there we are, in books that are not primarily biblical, isn't it?
No.
No?
No. So, and what about the biblical text? The text?
Well, the biblical text...
Is it in red?
No, unfortunately this is a monochrome reproduction, but what you can see here, sushter, that is in red, and then a bit lower down, tulkovanie, that is in red.
Yeah, yeah.
But the text itself is all in black.
Well, I suspect there are biblical quotations in the commentaries.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah. They are not indicated.
They are not indicated as such in this manuscript. They are, yes, I mean obviously one does get this type of marginal sign to indicate biblical quotations sometimes in manuscripts which are not primarily, or in texts which are not primarily biblical. But what you've got in either case is simply a means of differentiation. This is one thing, this is another.
Do you have many such examples?
This is not unusual.
Not
unusual.
I have seen manuscripts where, for example, prayers are indicated in the same way, because I suppose they could be used separately from the text. It's written in a margin and then these commas indicate the size of the prayer.
Yes, and it's basically simply a means of saying this is one sort of text, this is another sort of text.
So in this case there are two levels of text.
Yes, there's the actual text of the epistle, and then there's the commentary.
And what I have seen are three levels of text. The biblical text, which is commentated,
yes,
the commentaries, and in the commentaries differentiation between the biblical quotations and the speculations in the commentator.
Yes.
Други коментари върху този толкова интересен и обемист материал, който засягаше фактически цялото средновековие, не само славянското. In fact, we haven't in Orthodox tradition such a rich illustration and decoration in the margins with this kind of
no, and the East was much more obedient to the proper function of these manuscripts.
It also may be due to material and to...
Well, no, I mean because there are very richly decorated manuscripts in the Eastern tradition, but the norms and the canons of decoration are much more strictly observed whereas in the West people just get out of hand.
Thank you. Another comments? Yes, please.
Was there any kind of censorship concerning the type of comments that you could include in the margins?
By the time that you get something like an organized state apparatus, then, yes, in 17th century Muscovy, for example, there was strict control over what could be printed and strict control over what print material could be imported. So to that extent, where central control is possible, it could be imposed at earlier periods or in places such as southeastern Europe after Turkish invasions, where there was no central apparatus to control it. Then, of course, no.
Нещо друго? Виждам. Може би да нам благодарим в този момент на професор Клемисън.